Okay, welcome everyone. Grab your beverage of choice and maybe keep the antacids within reach because we need to talk about the election platform nonsense. I'm Nick, your host.
I'm Rio.
And I'm German.
And yes, it is nonsense. Not because policy doesn't matter, but because apparently nobody got the memo that elections aren't supposed to be a surprise party. Let me tell you why that's bullshit. The Liberals dropped their platform on Easter weekend, the sacred time when Canadians are traditionally reading 65 pages of policy PDFs over chocolate bunnies and awkward brunches with their in-laws. And the Conservatives held out even longer, waiting until Wednesday, April 26th, aka the literal last possible moment to publish theirs. Not a soft launch, not a leak, just surprise, here's our entire vision for the country. Hope you can read fast. Seriously, how are we supposed to engage meaningfully with platforms they clearly didn't want us to read? This isn't a group project, it's a national election. And treating voters like we're the kid you remember after the PowerPoint's already been emailed to the teacher, that's not leadership, that's disrespect. So in this episode, we're going to break it all down. Not just what they're saying, but what they're hiding, who they're blaming, and why some of this reads like fanfic. You're going to hear the vibes and voices straight from the source. We've got conservative promises to lock up criminals and cut red tape like it's 1995, and Jean Chrétien just got a modem. Liberal manifestos about sovereignty and shadows, and bold decorations like if America won't lead, Canada will. Okay, Carney, calm down. We're still using fax machines in some government offices. So let's dive in.
We have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
Okay, guys, how are you?
I'm good.
Rio, Rio, you're so unconvincing.
Yeah, I'm alive. So
that's a step up from this morning.
Yeah, this morning I was sick. Last night I was sick. Now I'm less sick. But on the bright side, Oblivion Remastered came out. So that's been awesome. And Nick, you and I were talking about this earlier. The Switch 2 pre-orders open up at Walmart at 10 p.m. tonight. So yeah, I'm excited for that. So we have a hard stop time.
10:01
for that,
but
right?
only at Walmart.
Yeah. I literally have the Walmart page already open. I'm just going to smash the refresh button as soon as 10:01 hits. So,
did you upload your credit card?
Oh,
I uploaded my credit card and I created an account. I'm going to get one and you're not.
Nope. I guess I'll do that in between my bits on the show.
I know who to bug if I need to borrow your machines.
Of course, I'm going to have at least one of those. Okay. Oh, and thanks for asking, German. I'm fine. I'm stoked also about the Nintendo Switch. I was doing some game streaming earlier, which is why I'm decked out in Mario and Kirby stuff. Plus, it just makes me happy. And this is not going to be very happy. So with that said, let's just jump right into the introduction. I thought we would start. Do I still have it? I don't. So I thought we would start by, I thought I had a video, but I don't. I thought we'd start by just going over the main points of the platforms, the things that they wanted to make sure were in our face, which is very telling. So the Liberals had 4 main points right at the beginning of their document. Free trade in Canada by July 1st, which is Canada Day. I think they did that on purpose. Achieve mutual recognition of credentials within provinces and territories so Canadians can work where they want. This is also mostly aimed at doctors and nurses and those professions that have very specific regulations, mental health workers, that kind of stuff. Red tape. He wants to undertake reviews and do reporting progress reports on the different departments within government, and then protect our economic sovereignty by unlocking projects that grow our economy. So Mark Carney, very focused on Canadian sovereignty. He wants you to be thinking about Donald Trump as you're reading his document. The Conservatives also had 4 main points. Well, 3 1/4. The first point was cut the deficit by 70% with less spending on bureaucracy, consultants, and foreign aid. Rio, you can talk about that in a few minutes. Lower income tax by 15%, lock up criminals, and then literally their last point was put Canada first. I don't mean to make fun of them, but that's not really like that shouldn't be there. That's not. What are you guys doing?
I mean, are we putting Canada second otherwise is like the main thing, right? Like,
it
or
kind of
maybe Russia's first all of a sudden, right?
it kind of made me think about when I was watching the debate and they were talking about Pierre Poilievre was doing his like notwithstanding violent criminals thing, and Jagmeet Singh interrupted him, as he did a lot, to say that like, come on, it's not like all of us on stage want to let criminals off. Like nobody up here wants to see violent criminals go loose. So it kind of reminded me of that, right?
Yeah.
So let's go back to the Liberals for a minute and just kind of talk about like a very big overview of the document. So the Liberal platform itself is really dense. It was 65 pages long, small print, which is about triple the Conservative platform, which is 30 pages, large print. And almost every page was at least a quarter to a half of just like promotional pictures of Pierre Poilievre. If not full, they had 3 pages of full advertising basically in it. Which isn't, we can get into later about like whether that's good or bad. But that's to say the Liberal document was super dense. I did like that it had like, this is what we're going to do. This is the context and this is why we're going to do it. So it was a bit more comprehensive than the Conservatives, because the Conservatives, well, they did explain some things. They were mostly just like, we're going to lock up criminals.
Yeah.
And right, like very like, but it was also very digestible, right? Which Carney's wasn't. So I did kind of appreciate that from the Conservative platform, because I was like, yeah, I can just read this. Took me about an hour and a half to read the Conservative platform and do notes last night. Then I was up till 2 a.m. reading and taking notes on Carney's platform. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only Canadian in Canada that is not officially a part of any party that actually read that fucking document. You're welcome, everyone. The tone was very red Tory. One of his top 3 priorities was cutting red tape. As we know, especially in Alberta, that is very much a Conservative talking point, cut red tape. So I'll kind of hand it over. There's a couple things I do want to talk about it later, but like what were your guys' thoughts upon seeing that and sort of the Liberals' main points? Rio, go.
Sure.
German and I have talked a lot this week.
Sure. And I actually spent some time reading the Liberal platform this afternoon because, nothing better to do when I'm sick and taking a day off work. So, but
we're a fun crowd.
Yeah, we're a fun crowd. But a lot of for me, when I was kind of reading through the Liberal platform, like I agree it does come across as very red Tory. And then like even when I got to like the costing section, like I feel like it makes a lot of sense, right? And like in a lot of ways, like the Liberal platform shares a lot of similarities with the Conservative platform, like increasing the number of like CBSA officers and RCMP officers, and the number strengthening law enforcement. So there are a lot of like little bits and pieces like that where it's like, yeah, this really is like 2 sides of the same coin, and that's where you get that red Tory bit, right? And
in crime, it's not a bad thing. You want that mixed methods approach.
Exactly. And especially especially considering like Canada's like the 2nd largest country in the world, and it's so diverse. And I mentioned this to you, Nick, before like German hopped on, of like I was driving out from I drove out to Drumheller for the weekend. I went to go see the museum, and then driving back home, I blasted through the town of Basiker, population 680 people, with an RCMP station that I'm pretty sure had no one in it, and so I just like drove right past it, going like 70, and I was like, oh, whoops, that was a 50 zone.
They were all at the one coffee place in town.
Yeah, the one coffee place in Basiker,
which I think is that gas station on the corner.
Yeah, it's like really says a lot, right? So yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are. Like I see the perspective, and like especially with regards to law enforcement, you do want that additional support, but Yeah, the 2000, like the 1000 versus 2000 at the same time too. You have to think about like, is that really going to do much to really stamp down crime, especially when crime doesn't tend to happen or the extreme crimes don't tend to happen as often in like population 680 towns like Basic or Alberta, right? It's mostly in like big cities like the greater metropolitan Toronto area or like Calgary, Edmonton, so on.
Well, I see, the thing is, and this was the other thing that irked me about both of their platforms. It's one thing to say like we're going to hire 1,000 RCMP officers, but where are you hiring? And I suspect that for Mark Carney, because he also spends a lot of time talking about organized crime and tackling that. So I have a feeling that we'll see more hiring in specialty RCMP stuff to deal with the border and deal with fentanyl and deal with organized crime to sort of appease Donald Trump's fake lying fentanyl thing that he's blaming on Canada for a reason to tariff and invade us. Yeah, so I suspect it'll be less like officer bodies and more like specialized case RCMP officers.
Yeah.
German, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you guys for sure. And it is definitely it's like you said, twice the size of the conservative platform. And it's very heavily, there's lots of heavy text and things like that. Not many images I've noticed from what the pages I've seen.
There's zero, none.
And that's the thing, right? It's very like reading a
Other
book.
than like the front page.
Yeah, and I noticed that too. But the one thing, I'll take a little bit of a different approach in terms of that particular platform. Is the one thing I really liked is that the fact that it really emphasized Canadian voices, and that's where I really zoomed in, because they talked about giving money to these arts organizations. As some of the listeners might know, is that I was actually sitting on a few art sports. And so for me, that really speaks to me as an arts lover and an art supporter and a supporter of the arts. They want to increase and support Canadian artists, creators by increasing funding to agencies such as Canadian Council of the Arts, Telefilm, Canadian Media Fund, and the National Film Board. So for me, that's something that really stood out in this particular platform, and I really think that was something that I like really noticed, and I didn't see something similar in the conservative platform.
There isn't.
So for me, that's something that really stood out. And like, yes, it's double the pages, it's very heavy text, so unless you're really interested in reading it, I personally would have read it myself, right? So that's my opinion, and I totally agree with what you two have said already on those things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like, and we're definitely going to get into like the weeds later on. So I thought it's pretty important for me to make sure that I'm looking objectively at it. People get very angry at me because it's very clear that I don't like Pierre Poilievre. I think he'll be bad for Canada. And I'm very much of a liberal ideology, not of the party. Liberal ideology. They're different people. But yeah, like there were things overall that I really liked. So personally, the global leadership stuff, it's like a big task. Canada's very small. So like it's a little dreamy, but he did write on pages 19 and 20. It was and he said this a couple of times in press releases, like when talking to reporters and giving speeches over the campaign. This was pretty much exactly taken from those speeches. So he said, "It was America that once declared itself a shining city on a hill, but today it is casting a shadow. We will step out from behind the shadow to defend our sovereignty and our values around the world. If the United States no longer wants to lead, Canada will." And see, this is super interesting to me because anybody that knows their history knows that America was the one that centered themselves as sort of like the global leader. They were the ones with nuclear weapons as an example. And the trade-off there was them saying like, we don't want any of you to have nuclear weapons, but don't worry, like we're going to protect you from Russia. And in fact, they also got the Ukraine to de-arm themselves from their nuclear weapons, which is like super ironic today, given the way Ukraine's being treated, and kind of is well, the US has basically screwed themselves at this point because it's going to take generations for them to claw their way back up to any kind of trust. So I thought that was really interesting because Mark Carney is an economist and he's looking at this as an opportunity. And that opportunity is, well, when you're that global that global leader, that's why we have the reserve. The US currency is our reserve global currency, which makes their currency basically one of the most valuable currencies in the world. It's why people put their money in America. That kind of thing, right? So yeah, I think that he's really thinking economically that it's a good place for Canada to be. Because if suddenly like the Canadian dollar becomes a global reserve currency, and like I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it's definitely something you can move towards, right? And Mark Carney has his eye on Europe. We know that. He already has ins with many European leaders because of his tenure at the Bank of England. So people were kind of making fun of me about the EU stuff, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for Mark Carney to do everything he can to pull us into the EU. So I don't know. I'll throw it over to you guys. What did you think? What did you guys think about his global leadership pitch?
German, why did you take this one first?
Rio's like, I have to think about it.
It's an interesting approach for sure, and I think it's something that I think he's thinking with the issues that are going on at the states level. I think he's thinking as an opportunity for Canada to build those relationships across different countries, and I think that it is an interesting approach, and it definitely is something to consider. It's something we would have to figure out whether we want to be part of the EU, right? Because there's a lot of restrictions, like do we keep our same currency, for example, all those other things that come with it, right? So I think that it's something that maybe he's trying to think as a trade perspective, whether there's an opportunity to build relationships, but at the same time, we want to make sure we maintain, I guess, our nationalism, or like our view as an independent country too, because there's a certain type of level of collectivism that might be from that situation. But it's definitely an interesting approach for sure.
Yeah, and like kind of building on that, so my thought process always and I think I mentioned this on the podcast a couple of times. I was like,
we've had this conversation.
Yeah, I'm pro Canada being more involved with the EU, or like pro Kanzuk as an example, right?
Yeah,
because like I think he's right in that, like, if the United States is kind of starting to pull back into a more isolationist position, it makes sense for Canada to kind of try and fill that gap a little bit more by going to Europe, going to like Australia, New Zealand, going into Asia as another example, and saying like, hey, do you guys want a reliable trading partner like right next door to the United States that can help you get your products there, or big economy that's also like very profitable and very stable? Canada's where you want to go, right? Like our economy isn't enormous, don't get me wrong. Where like, what was it? When I looked at the Wikipedia last time, it was like $4 trillion like total, compared to the United States is like 45 trillion, right? So like our economy is 10% of the United States, but that's still a lot of opportunity for everyone. And then like, tie that into the European Union, like about 20 trillion. And then all of a sudden you're almost at 30 trillion. So you're almost on par with the United States economy, right? So there's an opportunity there. And I think Carney's right to kind of start pursuing that. Is like, it's a good chance to help put Canada in a better position going forward, and less dependent on the United States as well. Because as we've clearly seen in the last like 4 months alone, we can't really depend on the United States anymore, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's talk about the Conservatives. And I'm going to put some context behind them. Well, not context, but I'll say that the things that we wanted to talk about in this segment are more a little bit of criticism. We'll get into the good parts, the few that there were, in my opinion, in the Conservative platform a bit later. But one thing that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's really important, and German, I want your insight on this because you work in like finance. Mm-hmm. So on page 5 for our readers, and if anybody's looking for these platforms, the Conservative one is really hard to find on their website, but it's going to be linked in the description below, as is Carney's. I'll also link a couple CBC and Global News articles on like comparing the platforms. But on page 5 of the conservative platform, they talk at the about halfway down, the bring it home tax reform, where it says, actually, I'm going to actually pull this up because I want to read the whole bit. Page 5. Okay. Bring it home tax reform. After a decade of increasing complexity and loopholes that benefit the wealthy and well-connected, it's time to bring fairness and simplicity back to our tax system. We'll put people who actually build things in charge of designing tax code that works for Canadians who actually do the work. Within 60 days of forming government, we will launch a tax reform task force made up of farmers, builders, entrepreneurs, economists, and workers, not Ottawa insiders. Their job will be to deliver a simple, fair tax code that rewards work and savings, closing loopholes for the wealthy and well-connected, eliminates unnecessary red tape, and makes it easier for Canadians to file and understand their taxes. So in terms of the goal for this, that all sounds fine. Where my concern is the absolute insanity of having farmers and other sort of blue-collar workers making our tax codes. Like, does that kind of raise a red flag to anyone else? Like, I'm very pro, like, talking to people, doing your research, getting people's perspectives, but this sounds insane to me.
Yeah, I'll answer that question a little bit. I'm a little bit confused by that, to be honest with you, because yeah, I get farmers are workers, builders, I can understand, maybe entrepreneurs, depending on the entrepreneurs, economists, workers. I don't know, because each of those people are very different from each other, right? And I get that they're not Ottawa insiders, but at the same time, entrepreneurs have a different type of tax level, just at the best of times. And then, of course, I don't know, like workers have a different type of tax level as well. So
Even understanding of basic taxes.
yeah, and I don't know whether farmers necessarily understand taxes either. And most farmers don't really
They don't
earn
even
money.
do their own taxes.
And most of the farmers don't actually earn a lot of money. From my experience, when I was working at the government, a lot of them didn't even have income, let alone profit most years, because of how much it costs to be a farmer. Like there's a lot of capital costs. There's a lot of, costs that come in terms of, buying stuff for your farm, buying things for the animals like feed. So I really don't know how this will actually work and how big this task force would be. Like, and I feel like entrepreneurs, a lot of them are pretty wealthy and pretty well connected anyway, depending on the business.
You think they're going to want to close loopholes?
And I don't think they would be fighting for the average person. I can understand maybe workers might, but at the same time, I don't know a lot of workers that even understand taxes, let alone even know taxes, depending on where they work and what role they're in.
Or even the current tax code, right?
Yeah, and that's something they would need to know, right?
Like, I'm a sociologist that specializes in crime and mental health. I've never done my own taxes in my whole life. My mother-in-law does our taxes. They own
and there's a lot of stuff,
so like I don't know anything about taxes. I would never be like, put me on that committee.
There's a lot of things that even I don't know as well, because it changes. Taxes change constantly, year to year, period
Sometimes
to period.
during tax season, look at the capital gains stuff.
Yeah, and all that changes, and unless you're a tax expert, maybe a CPA or a tax lawyer, you really don't know the nitty-gritties of what taxes are and those special deductions and special credits you can take on. So to throw in like workers, economists, entrepreneurs, farmers, and builders, I'm not sure whether that would really help, especially when you have entrepreneurs who are mostly well-connected people and they own their own businesses. So do you really think they would want to really create a system that brings fairness? I don't think so. But unless he's bringing certain people that really care about the economy and care about people, but I don't think entrepreneurs have that mentality of making it fair for everyone, because they're the ones, if anything, they don't want to pay taxes. A lot of owners, especially the small business owners, do not want to pay taxes. I can understand the workers maybe, but I don't know how many workers actually understand their own taxes.
Nobody
right?
wants to pay taxes.
And like
Yeah.
farmers, like they don't even earn money. So if not hardly any money. So I don't know how that works. Builders, I don't know why he would have chose builders as well. So I'm kind of confused kind of how that really creates fairness, because it kind of gets rid of all the other people, right? The other people who are not even like involved in those areas, right? Why certain people
Yeah.
are included?
Yeah. Like,
That's my take.
yeah. And like,
All I all I can think about right now is how I'm not gonna get like destroyed in the comments because German was just talking about farmers. Yes.
But at the same time, like I'm not saying farmers are not, they don't earn, I'm not saying that they're not, but at the same time, like for me, farmers don't earn a lot of income from my experience. Like they just don't, because it's so much cost involved.
Yeah,
Right?
but people are gonna be like, that doesn't mean we don't get say in the tax code.
But at the same, I'm not saying you guys don't, farmers don't understand, but why
just
do you
giving you a
choose
hard
certain
time.
these people, right?
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs especially, right?
Oh, for sure. Like you said, they're gonna fight for wealthy. Rio, sorry, I cut you off.
no, it's fine. Because I just had like I was thinking about this a little while ago. Because like what usually happens, especially for farmers, and like they mentioned this in like my favorite book, The Dictator's Handbook, is like usually they get tax credits, right? And like tax credits are a great way to reward farmers for like doing their job. And like you said, German, like they tend to not make a lot of profit or a lot of money in general because like it's so expensive to do, right? Like if you have like say I have a buddy's his family has a farm that's like 10 acres as an example, right? So like if you have 10 acres of land, you're paying property tax on that, in addition to the fact that you have to like, seed it, fertilize it, keep it watered throughout the summer. And in Alberta, we get hot summers, right? Like you're not going to be able to just like water it and be like, yeah, we can get away with it for 2 days. Like, no, you need to keep those fields, like you need to keep them going. So like I can understand the perspective of having like diverse, or I can understand the idea of having diverse perspectives at the table, but you're both right that like, an entrepreneur is going to be like, well, I don't want to pay more taxes. That's not fair. Like, to my perspective, I was an entrepreneur. That wouldn't be fair to me. Similarly, a farmer would be like, well, why would I have to give my tax credit just for like da 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 da? And like, it doesn't make sense. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, you can just focus group this, or you can like survey this, or you can even just like, do a quantitative analysis of this and just see like what the data says, like who's making how much, and like generally speaking, like in what fields, and then kind of like tailor your tax code from there. So like, and full disclosure, my understanding of the tax code is like, I understand that I pay taxes into a system that's supposed to give me things. And like, I
Most
got
of
my
your taxes go to healthcare, Rio.
yeah, I know. And like I got my carbon tax
In
rebate the other
Alberta,
day.
healthcare.
Healthcare, yeah. I got my carbon tax rebate the other day, but like that's about it. That's all I know, really.
It'll be the last one you'll get.
Yep.
And I'll just add quickly before we kind of move on, or whatever you want to talk about. 60 days of forming government, that's a really short time frame. That's like 2 months. Does that, if you're cutting public service, you're cutting civil servants who work for the government, do you really think there's even enough time to do that in 2 months when you form government? There's so many other things that might be needed to work on.
There is
like,
if you're gonna do a shitty job at it.
And I'll just add farmers. Like I know farmers when I was dealing with them at the government. I know a lot of them work long hours. They work long days. Do you really think they have a time to jump on a call or meet with you, because they're worried about their produce and their animals and whatnot?
And it's interesting you bring that up, because I consult with a not-for-profit that works with farmers a lot, and it is a pain in the ass to get them anywhere. And the only way to do it is to like visit their house basically, and like sit at their table, have a cup of coffee, and be like, answer my questions. I helped create like focus groups for farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible experience. So like good luck getting them on a Zoom call to talk about tax code.
And I'll just add quickly, now that you bring that up, because I remember when I was working with farmers, and to get a hold of them and tell them that they owe money in taxes, they don't even know what it even means. Like they're saying, how do I owe money? Who do I owe money to? How do I pay? They don't even know anything. So you have to educate them too. Like I'm not saying farmers don't know things, but farmers and anyone else
what they know is carbon soil.
Yeah, they don't know what the tax system works,
Fertilizers.
right now. And other people might not know the tax system, including those people listed there. But you need to spend time educating them first, right? And so to even get them on a phone call is almost impossible, let alone hard to do,
Yeah,
right?
and
So
then do it in 60 days.
that's unrealistic, in my opinion.
That's a nice way of putting it. Okay, so speaking of like taxes and money and stuff, let's talk a little bit about the fiscal stuff in the platform. So we're going to watch something from a former parliamentary budget officer that'll give us like a really good take to take into the rest of the conversation and into our first segment. But I wanted to talk about what the Conservatives on page 26, for anybody that's following along, okay, want to do. And so there's a line that's 2025 and 2026. So they want to gain revenue, which is from either cuts or expanding resources. One of the things that came up on here is things like cutting funding to CBC. So I want to just talk a little bit about that. German, I know you were fairly interested in talking about CBC and defunding. What's really interesting to note is that they don't want to cut Radio Canada, which for our Anglophone listeners is the Francophone CBC.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And they don't want to cut the Radio Canada, which is the French side.
Which is like just to try to get more votes in Quebec, which we've talked about this on the show before. Cutting any kind of journalism in Quebec would actually be a huge it would basically be political suicide in Quebec. Quebecers really like their media because they see them as their voice for sovereignty. It's one of the reasons why media out of Quebec talk quite frequently about how Poilievre kind of messed up by treating the media the way he does, because Quebecers look at that and they're like, well, we can't trust you worth anything. So in there on page 23, they say we will save by defunding the CBC and reforming Crown corporations. They don't say what other Crown corporations, which is interesting. While maintaining Radio Canada services, English language CBC should be a Canadian-owned, self-sufficient media organization that is a not-for-profit and supported by listeners, donations, sponsorships, ad revenue, and licensing revenue. I'll let you talk about this a little bit, German.
Yeah, that's, for me, is a very interesting point, because when you look at the Liberal platform, for example, they talk about investing in these things, like they invest in CBC. So it's a big contrast between the two in terms of what they want to approach. I actually have a friend who works for CBC in Nova Scotia, which I don't like. I'm not going to mention the name, but I think she'd be pretty embarrassed that I'm talking about her anyway. But she's a nice person, so I won't mention any names. But she said to me that she has trouble paying her rent. She's an associate producer for one of the morning shows in CBC, and she said to me, I said to her, "Why are you having trouble paying your rent, and what's going on?" She said, "I said, are you not working enough, or what's going on?" She said, "I'm working too much, but the salary I'm getting paid is not even enough to cover my rent." And so, like, if you defund the CBC, especially the English, she worked for the Nova Scotia one, can you imagine? She'll be paid even less, and she's working like 12, 13, 14 hour, 15 hour, 16-hour days. So it's like she's overworked and underpaid. So that's crazy, right? If you think about it.
Which
right?
I think Poilievre would argue that if you privatize it, she'll make more money.
Yeah, but at the same time, like
No, I'm just saying that would be the conservative argument.
And that probably is, right? But you look at something like the Liberal platform, they're investing in culture and arts and all these things.
$150 million to CBC right away, they said.
And that's the thing. And so the only reason the Conservatives are not taking on the Radio Canada is because they want that French vote, right? So, and that's the thing that
they won't get right now.
Yeah, they probably won't get it, but they're still trying. And it makes it seem like they are prioritizing certain services and certain things over others, right? Which is not good for culture-wise in Canada, let alone media in Canada. Like you see all these, like he says he wants to boost local journalism. $25 million for local news. Like, we know local news is starting to die now. Like,
Yeah.
all local stations are starting to die. So like,
Even legacy media, people don't want to watch that. They're going to podcasters like Joe Rogan,
yeah, and that's the thing about it. And so
which
like,
is scary.
it's so scary. And so you're not really funding a public broadcaster, which I get there's probably savings to be made and there's like stuff that needs to be efficient and all this stuff. But it just kind of creates a contradictory thing. And it kind of creates a red flag when you're supporting French, but you're not supporting English, right? And whereas like the Liberals are funding CBC, they're investing in this thing, they're investing in culture. And for me, that's a bit of a scariness to it. It's like, why are you not? And they say a new conservative government restore free speech, protect personal liberties, and honor our shared story and promote Canadian culture and history. So for me, that really kind of goes contradictory. And it says we would support media freedom by these things. So it doesn't really help with anything, right?
Yeah, and it really contrasts the liberal platform too, because the liberal platform has a whole section about like, kind of uniting Canadians and uniting Canada, and then like you already mentioned the 150 million to CBC as an example, but like nation building is more than like, you can't nation build by making it harder for people to find information relevant to their country and other parts of the country.
Indigenous people, as an example, CBC is pretty much one of, in fact, if not the only place for a lot of Indigenous culture and Indigenous news.
Yeah.
I don't see CTV reporting on the ins and outs of things that are happening in Indigenous communities, but there's entire sections for it on the CBC website.
Yeah, or if you see it, like as another example too, like that show North of North on the CBC Gem, it's about it's a North, like, Nunavut community. They're all Inuvik. It's a I watched 2 episodes and I was like, okay, I'll get to this later. But it was a good show and it was really interesting because I was like, cool, never thought about this before, right? And like that's one of those perspectives that I wouldn't have had without the CBC, because I've never seen that kind of show on like CTV or Global, right? Especially Global, which will play like, oh yeah, it's SWAT again, but like in another city, and something about firefighters this time, like different
the
different
10th Law and Order.
Oh my god, yeah, that.
And I should add quickly, because you bring up the whole thing on Global and CTV, is that you notice when you see these media outlets and when profit and when it's a public company worried about shareholder value, you see those companies, they start cutting stations and reporters across the country. You see that with CTV, you see that with Global, and so they start cutting. I think Global
CNN.
Right now, yeah, CNN, right, for example, right, and you see this they start cutting people. For example, I know Global right now, they have a lot of their news for certain weekend editions are coming out of Edmonton, so they're cutting local stations. So $25 million is a drop in the bucket compared to how much these stations and these local stations need right now.
Yeah.
So it's a small, and so it's like it kind of contradicts. And you talk about funding first made Canadian documentaries, for example, about Canadian contribution. How are you going to promote that if you don't have a media outlet to do that, right?
The answer is he's not. Speaking of cuts, Rio, you wanted to talk about foreign aid. So another thing that Polyev is going to get, he's counting it as technically like, this was the other thing that bothered me. His revenue stuff was all based on what he was cutting. And like in his revenue section, he has listed revenue from carbon tax cuts. Like it made my brain hurt. I know. Yeah, because then they get to open up resource, right? So then they like gain revenue from that. And then they talk about revenue gain from cutting Bill C-69, which was a bunch of crap that German and I talked about the other day. So if anybody's really interested in that, it's one of the many, many videos that went on our YouTube page this week. But foreign aid, that's another thing that Pierre Poilievre wants to cut. Who does that sound like, Rio?
Yeah, I know. Who does that sound like? It's our neighbor down south. And like I've mentioned this before, and like especially to the two of you, and I know for sure I mentioned this on the podcast, but foreign aid is a tool to get policy concessions from other countries, right? And like, I think I gave the example before of like, I think it was Denmark that sent ships down to like Africa on the condition that whenever the ships need maintenance, they get sent back to Denmark for maintenance, right? They didn't authorize the people in the countries that they sent the ships to do the work themselves, which is a policy and like, of course they're like, well, we need the ships, so yeah, we'll take the deal. But it benefited Denmark because, you know, they had the sale and they have the maintenance contracts for the next, like, you know, 15, 20 years, the lifetime of the ship, whatever it is. And like, that's a huge amount of money from one country, right? So cutting foreign aid is just one of those things where it's like, well, you're giving up your ability to get those policy concessions from other countries. And like, with food becoming more expensive because, you know, climate change, or, you know, Russia invading Ukraine, or as another example, yeah, right, or tariffs as another example, yeah, like, you need ways to kind of like get the prices lower for those imports, and a good way to do that would be through things like foreign aid. So like, to me, cutting it is kind of dumb. And like, yes, funneling it into defense like is not the worst idea. Like, I can definitely think of like other ones that I would probably be more in favor of, but you're giving up your ability to get a policy concession in order to, you know, basically, you know, fund the military a bit more when you could, you know, help mitigate some of the problems that the average Canadian is going to have by using foreign aid as a tool. So like, I want to take a minute to criticize that, because I think it's kind of a like, I think it's kind of a bad move. Like, why would I want to give up that leverage I have over someone else when, you know, in order to gain like a military advantage that's not going to be very meaningful against someone like, say, Russia or the United States? And then the other part of that too is we already have so much, like, Canada has like such a good reputation like internationally for these kinds of things, that like, you're giving up that other part, which then has the problem of you've given up, like what the US has done, you've given up your position of power to be like, yeah, no, Canada first, I'm going to cut this and I'm going to take my ball and go home because I don't want you guys to play with it. So,
But it's probably going to be infected with Ebola.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I don't know. It's just, I can think of better policy alternatives than cutting foreign aid and putting it into the defense, right? And like, to not
Foreign aid is also, though, like such a like drop in the bucket that it's not really going to make a difference to, just like in the US, it's not going to make a difference to the defense budget.
Yep. Like, and if you cut it in half, put that in the defense budget, that's however many millions of dollars. That's not enough to really make a difference, like on a large scale military, right? And like, you know, say $5 million as an example, like really easy number. Like, you pay a private in the Canadian forces about $45,000 a year, if I did my estimate correctly. Like,
and both parties want to give raises to military.
Yeah.
Which,
so
like, yay, I'm very in favor of that.
Yeah, which is a great policy. But like, you know, if you get that extra 5 million, how many extra soldiers is that really, right? Anyway, yeah, that's my little criticism of what I consider to be a not smart move by the Conservative Party that I think could be supplemented by something better.
And I guess the only thing I'd add is on the flip side of that, Carney wants to basically also step into a global leadership role there, because he's talking about increasing foreign aid where the US is sort of screwing up here. Side note on that, he's also talking about increasing research funding in order to get researchers that are basically being cut in the US on like major projects like cancer and other things, to also bring them to Canada. So I don't know. I feel like one of those policies is definitely better than the other.
Yep.
I'm pro defeating cancer. Okay, so really quickly, just to sort of like give us something to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, we're going to look at what Kevin Page had to say about both platforms, and they rate them. So hang on, let me do a screen share here in my like scene setup from the weekend. Entire screen. Sure. Okay. So we'll watch the Conservative one first.
Now to talk about what he found. And Kevin, of course, is a former parliamentary budget officer. So Kevin Page, it's good to see you. Thanks for doing this. And I know you're rushing to get these out the door, so we appreciate you being here, sir.
Good to be with you, David.
All right, so let's start with the conservative platform because it's the one that is the hottest off the press. They assume that their policies will increase economic activity and create more than $50 billion in new tax revenue. I mean, was it reasonable for them to include that in their math based on what you've looked at?
No. It's pretty much a traditional practice, David, in the financial community, to be aware of what the potential, positive economic impacts could be from, putting in measures, but actually to have them hit a bottom line is sort of to take credit and plan based on create a lower deficit track. That isn't, it's not a good budgeting practice. So I would say that is a mistake, on the conservative part.
Okay, so let's go through this because I've just been handed sort of the IFSD fiscal credibility assessment. For the conservatives, and we'll go through the liberals right after this because they're the two main contenders for power here. You give them an overall assessment of a pass. Principle 1, realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, pass. Responsible fiscal management, pass. And transparency, good. When I was in school, a pass was pretty good for me. I mean, what should we take from this that it is a pass as opposed to a higher overall assessment? What does that tell us?
Well, I think if in general, I'd say that there's a lot of good things that were done in all the platforms, including the Liberals and the NDP and the Conservatives. And in terms of assumptions, it's clear we know what their planning base is. Mm-hmm. We know that they're working from the parliamentary budget officers sort of pre-election, pre-tariff impact baseline, so we can work from that. They're articulating challenges, economic and fiscal challenges. And they're highlighting risk with respect to the United States. So we can we score those. I think it's clear to us, like in this environment. I think it's clear to the electorate that we're dealing with a major crisis, and that's going to create is creating enormous economic instability. And I think why the Conservatives get a pass and not a higher rating, a good rating, is that. We don't think they've properly taken into account the additional risk from the instability that we're starting to experience already, and it's really going to get worse. So, I mean, that's why they get a pass.
Okay, so when we look at the revenue, though, that they put in there, because it's difficult to do a straight apples-to-apples comparison with the Liberal platform, which, again, we'll get to because they don't book the revenue. When you look at revenue gain from additional homes built, revenue gain from capital gains measures, revenue gain from repealing C-69, clean electric regulations, these things, are those numbers credible or not credible, or is it just their inclusion that you sort of quibble with because it's not standard practice? How should we interpret the critique of that?
I think that there's two issues, David. One is, first, from a transparency perspective, it's fine to see what a party thinks could be the additional economic impact from a certain measure, a deregulation measure, a red tape measure. This is what we think the impact could be on GDP. We don't have a problem with that. I think, again, as I noted, to actually book that, so to speak, so you show a lower deficit track, we do have a problem with that. It's not a standard practice. It hasn't been in Canada for many decades, including past Conservative governments, including Mr. Harper's government. I think there's a major credibility problem with respect to those estimates. You go back to past budgets. I've seen you in these lockups, David. You look at those rules of thumb. 1 percentage point of real GDP growth probably gives you, a positive impact on the deficit on the bottom line of about $5-6 billion. So to actually generate $60 billion in additional revenues from deregulation, from the cutting of red tape over 4 years, that is an excessively high number. And then overlaying that, you're letting it go to the bottom line. So we have a problem with that.
Okay, last question on that. So when we look at the deficit numbers that the Conservatives are projecting, it adds up to about $130 billion, or no, that's the Liberal. Sorry. Even with a combined $131 billion from savings and new revenues, the Conservative platform is projecting a total deficit of about $100 billion over the next 4 years. So how should we judge those numbers? And then I'll move on to what the Liberals have put on the table.
Well, I think we judge those numbers by looking at what's behind them in terms of the assumption that we just talked about, the credibility issue with respect to booking those estimates. There's in addition, other parties also have issues there, where other party platforms. They're booking what we call efficiency savings. We have, we see over time, and I've been around for many decades, including program review years. We often put out numbers, and we see there's a lot of slippage. And we can look at the conservative platform where they see program efficiencies. They're thinking they're going to find $10 billion with the saving 4 years out just on consulting, and like the total number for that number for professional services is about $20 billion. Actually, the management consulting part is quite a bit smaller than that. So I don't think it's possible to wipe all of it out. A lot of those professional services are security services, they're accounting services, they're engineering services. So again, we look at that number. I mean, it's good that from a transparency perspective, the fact that they actually highlight a number, we can see where that is helpful. On the program cuts point of view, sometimes we do see slippages in those numbers, but they are transparent on that. We know there are significant cuts to 4 and 8 as an example. They're being transparent. We know that they plan to reduce the size of the workforce. We can look at those numbers. Sometimes you do get slippage, but they are being transparent. I think in terms of the amount of deficit, here we are, David. We're probably headed into a recession.
Yeah.
And we're having one of our major political parties says they can actually reduce the deficit as we head into a period of significant economic weakness. The government spends about $500 billion a year. We're a little over a $3 trillion economy. It's typical. You want governments to actually help stabilize the economy as we go through this instability. Instead, we have a plan actually that tries to reduce the deficit, both relative to the baseline and from an annual, like year-to-year adjustment. So there's a fiscal stance problem that I think some economists will have to actually, is this the time to try to reduce the deficit, particularly in 2025-26?
Okay.
Wait.
And I want to get into the Liberals quickly now, because you've given them an overall assessment of good on all the 3 principles: realistic and credible economic and fiscal assumptions, good; responsible fiscal management, good; transparency, good. Now, responsible fiscal management, they've got the deficits that are tens of billions of dollars higher than the Conservatives. You give them a pass. So why is a higher deficit platform good and a lower deficit platform only a pass? Explain that gap if you can.
So, in terms of like the deficit tracks in both the Conservatives and Liberals, if you look at the numbers, if you deflate them by the size of the economy, in the Liberal, the Conservative track, which we have some issues with, if you include those, those assumptions with respect to, positive revenue gains, they have the deficit kind of at 1% this year, falling to 0.4% 4 years out. The Liberals have the deficit at 2% this year as a percentage of GDP, falling to about 1.4%. So a higher deficit track in a smaller platform. I think from the point of view where the economy at, the size of the amount of weakness we see in the economy, it's not unusual to see the deficit get a little bit bigger in a period of weakness.
Right.
We saw the 2008 financial crisis. We saw during COVID. So I think, there's not that much different as a percentage of GDP, 1% to 0.5%, 2% to 1.4%. It's not an enormous difference that I think, bond rating agencies are going to focus on.
But the big difference, Kevin, I guess, in the way the 2 platforms are presented goes back to where I started this. There is no revenue baked into the fiscal track for the Liberals versus what the Conservatives have done. So Mr. Carney said today that if he had prepared his platform the same way the Conservatives prepared their platform, he'd be showing a surplus by year 4. Is that an accurate and fair statement?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that that's true. We didn't look at those sorts of numbers. Some credit to the Liberals. They did have an annex in their platform that did show the multipliers under different situations. Multipliers are like these positive economic benefits. If you spend $1 per capital investment, what might the return be? These returns, could be different depending on how weak or strong the economy is. So they present it, but they make a point, say we don't actually have prudence in this platform, but they do expect to see some positive economic gains from those, additional capital investment, which they are not showing. In fact, they're not even highlighting even as prudence, but they do make mention of it.
Okay, so just one last question, Kevin, before I let you go. So basically, if you stripped the revenue out of the Conservative platform and did it the same the Liberals did, or do revenue in the Liberal platform and the same methodology the Conservatives did, the deficit numbers are actually a whole lot closer together than the gap on first reading because of the different ways of preparation. Correct. Am I correct there?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And I think it's probably fair to say we have we have under Mr. Carney, Prime Minister Carney, the Liberal platform, somewhat of a hard target. They're saying they're going to balance the operating budget, in 2028-29. So it's a hard target that Parliament can hold the Liberals to account. I actually think they'll have a hard time meeting that target. I think the Conservatives, they don't actually have a hard target. They have kind of a fiscal rule saying if we're going to have additional spending, we're going to offset it. And if we're going to raise taxes, we're going to have a referendum. But they don't actually have a hard target, though the Conservatives are showing a much lower deficit track, as you noted. And that would be consistent with a declining debt to GDP ratio, which is a good practice.
Okay. Real quick, that was the other thing I forgot. They, in the Conservative platform, they said that if they were ever going to raise taxes or change taxes in any way, and they would make this like a law, that the government would have to do a referendum. Ridiculous.
Yeah, so you want to have a referendum every single year on taxes, because that's the other thing too, is the tax code changes every year. I know I made more money this year than I did last year, but that doesn't mean I'm
Making more money.
Yeah, that doesn't mean I'm making more money. Does that make sense? My boss told me the other day, she's like, "Yeah, you're getting a 3% raise." I was like, "Cool, cost of living adjustment. Thanks."
If that.
Yeah, if that. So
Nice.
Yeah, that's a big issue too. Can you imagine because I know there's a CPP gross up or whatever right now on a lot of these incomes if you earn a certain level of income. That's crazy. So pretty much every time you have something like that, you have to go back and vote. And those referendums,
They're not cheap.
Cost so much money. And just all kidding aside, when you look at these people, how many people actually vote in referendums, let alone elections? So
and what are they going to say? Yes, raise my taxes. I can tell you exactly what the outcome is going to be.
And honestly, if people keep on saying no, are you going to lower these taxes? Soon we won't even have money to even pay for the services we want or need. It's bad enough our healthcare is falling to pieces.
I was just going to say, maybe being the 51st state wouldn't be bad if that's the way we're gonna go.
And honestly, I can't see people voting yes to raising taxes. I can't see that happening. Even if they did vote, do you really think the majority would vote for raising taxes? Especially the people who are entrepreneurs and wealthy Canadians, they're going to say no every single time. Yeah. And I worked for the government. Sorry to go on a tangent, but we couldn't even get people to pay taxes. Even people who were workers didn't even want to pay taxes, and they justified it based on the fact they volunteered in their community. What is that? Just because I volunteer in my community doesn't mean you don't have to pay taxes? I don't know. This is going to be a system where there's not even enough money to support social programs, let alone anything. I don't know.
51st state, here we come. So I wanted to play, those are the longest clips. I only have one other one, and it's a minute long. But I thought it was really important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of this, which we'll try to go through, in a decent amount of time since it's 6:30 for us. I wanted to talk about U.S. relations.